Ladies and gentlemen, hello again, and welcome to another Reflected Reality Simulations video. My name is Graham, this is X-Plane 11 and the Hotstart TBM 900. This is part 4 of the video series, and we're going to look at circuits or traffic patterns, depending on which terminology you prefer. We're still at Dundee Airport on the east coast of Scotland. This is the threshold runway 09 and runway 27. We're going to use runway 27 for the circuits. Left-hand traffic out over the water here. The river is the River Tay. This is the Firth of Tay, or the Tay estuary, and it provides very good visual references. We've got the two bridges, especially here, the rail bridge and the road bridge. We're going to use that as part of planning how to fly around the circuit. Now, when student pilots are learning to fly, their instructors will very often show them local landmarks to help judge their position in the circuit effectively. What the instructors are trying to do is to make sure the students can repeatedly and reliably put themselves in the same part of sky so they can conduct a fairly straightforward approach and landing. The intention is to practice landings, and a good landing follows a good approach. But when you move on to flying to other airfields during your flight training, those same visual references that you learned may not necessarily be there. So the hope is that although you're flying with those visual references, you learn to look at the aspects and angles to the runway and judge your position in the pattern simply by looking at the airfield itself. So we're going to take a look at that today. We're also going to use the Garmin G1000 as fitted to TBM just to provide an additional piece of situational awareness. One of the things I find really hard in the simulator is judging how far cross-track you are. You saw in the previous video that we can use the range ring, that 1.25 mile ring there, but there's another way we can do it, and it's a little bit easier, I think, for flying circuits, and that is we can use the OBS function on the GPS here. So the GPS is navigating directly to Dundee Airfield. It's in GPS with terminal guidance, so full-scale deflection on the course deviation indicator is about 1 mile. In OBS mode, if I change the course, I can actually choose which course to fly inbound to that GPS waypoint. So if I put the course indicator on 272, which is the runway track at Dundee, this will provide an accurate cross-track distance all the way down the downwind leg. It's important to understand we're going to be flying by looking out the window, not flying looking at the primary flight display, but this is just an extra bit of situational awareness that we can use to help ourselves out. The other thing on the PFD is the bearing pointer. You see it's pointing to Dundee as well, the blue arrow here. We'll use that to judge the end of the downwind leg. So that should be fairly straightforward. If we're setting off on a pattern detail as a student pilot, we'd expect to have a fairly detailed brief before we got to the aircraft. Now that's not going to be very interesting. Instead, what I plan to do is to do 4 patterns. We'll do 2 at 1500 feet and 2 at 1000 feet. But on the first trip around the pattern, we'll pause the sim at the relevant points and have a look at what we're trying to achieve in the next phase. So rather than briefing it, we'll pause it on the way around just to get a good understanding of what to do next. So the aircraft is nearly ready to go. I'll just point the heading bug roughly on the runway direction, but I'm not going to use the flight directors today. This is primarily about flying out the window. We'll get the aircraft ready to go, so I'll put the pitot and the stall heaters on, flaps to takeoff, trims checked, and lights landing. So we've got DIS panel set, flaps takeoff, trims neutral, cache checked, battery less than 50 amps. We've got landing field elevation set, no flight directors, and all is good. So let's line up. So the aircraft is around about 2,900 kilograms. Rotation speed will be 84-85 knots. One of the primary pitfalls with a digital airspeed tape is trying to fly it precisely to the knot. With a round instrument, you wouldn't worry about that, plus or minus 5 knots. You would barely see with a round airspeed indicator. So we want to make sure that we're not chasing the digital values. You know, a few knots either side is appropriate. I'm going to demonstrate on this departure what the manual lists as a short field takeoff as well. Essentially, we're going to hold the aircraft on the toe brakes all the way up to 100% torque, and we're going to pitch to 15 degrees on the climb out. So as I said, we'll pause the sim through the first circuit and try and understand what's going on. But ready to go, toe brakes are held, power to 50% torque, make sure the prop RPM goes into the green zone, which it does, and I'll advance the torque with the brakes held, looking for just below 100%, which we have, brakes release. So rotating just below 85 knots. 60, 70, 80, rotate. Positive climb, gear up. So looking for 15 degrees, but I'll not let the speed bleed below 100 knots. So I'm just adjusting the pitch attitude to try and capture 100 knots. So let's pause here just for a moment. If you've learned to fly in aircraft like a 150, a Cessna 150 or a PA-38, that sort of thing, or you've seen any flight training material, you'll know those aircraft are very limited in climb performance, 600 or 700 feet a minute. The TBM doesn't suffer from that, we're doing 2,300 feet per minute. That means we don't have to maintain the best rate of climb all the way to the circuit altitude. We're going to fly the first pattern at 1,500 feet. So at 1,000 feet, I'm going to just reduce the pitch attitude to just below 10 degrees. At 15 degrees, we can scarcely see ahead of us, but below 10 degrees, we should start to see the horizon over the nose of the aircraft. Once we're within 300 feet of the pattern, which is about 1,200 feet, I'm going to roll left onto about a 25-degree angle of bank. Now, the primary flight reference is out the window here, not the PFD. So 25-degree angle of bank is going to be roughly the horizon running from the top left-hand corner of the windshield to the bottom right-hand corner. I'll also start easing the power off because I want to keep the aircraft below 115 knots, and we'll keep flaps at the takeoff position all the way around the circuit. Let's give it a go. So there's 1,000 feet, lowering the nose and just reducing the power slightly. Just below 10 degrees, I can see the horizon within 300 feet of the pattern, rolling to about 25 degrees and keeping the nose slightly above the horizon till we get to 1,500 feet. At 1,500 feet, I'll lower the nose so I can just see the horizon all the way over the top of the nose and bring the torque back to around about 30%. And we'll roll level on the crosswind here. I'll make sure that we trim the aircraft. So turning downwind, we're looking to aim roughly for the hill beyond the rail bridge there. Let's start the turn. And look at how that horizon is just sitting on top of the nose of the aircraft, running from one corner of the windshield to the other. It's much easier to fly with that big visual reference than the little PFD. It's not an issue we used to have on basic instruments, but with a very detailed PFD, the temptation very much is to fly the aircraft heads down. And we don't want to do that in the circuit. So pointing it roughly towards that hill there. Tracking downwind, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put the gear down. I'm going to increase the torque to 40% and hold the pitch attitude. 40% will offset the drag of the gear, and holding the pitch attitude counters the pitch down moment from the gear. And I'm going to retrim it so it maintains level flight. I'm just going to pause for a second here. So we're at the end of the downwind leg. You can see the runway underneath the wing, and this is the distance here that it's quite difficult to judge in a simulator. Looking at the primary flight display, you can see we've got the cross-track information 1.47 nautical miles. I was aiming for about 1.5 miles with my visual references, so that's fairly good. I'm fairly happy with that. What we need to do now is decide how far we're going to fly on downwind before we turn on to base. So I'd be looking over my shoulder, looking for the airfield to be around about this position here. That's 45 degrees. We can get this information from the PFD as well, and in the simulator I find it easier to fly looking forward than looking over my shoulder. So when the tail of this blue arrow here crosses this 45 degree reference there, then that is us at the end of the downwind leg. At that point I'm going to reduce the torque to about 20%, hold the pitch attitude, select flaps to landing, and then roll to 25 degrees and lower the nose to maintain 90 knots. Hopefully that will be straightforward as we do it. At the moment though, pause is released. We've got gear down, 3 greens, landing field elevation 17 feet, and fuel balanced. So look at how far up the windscreen the horizon is. That's our primary reference for flying. This instrument here is the angle of attack, or the alpha gauge. We'll have a talk about that on the base leg. Looking over our shoulder, the airfield's in the 45 degree point. You can see on the PFD, roughly at that 45 degree index. So I'll reduce the power to about 20%. Flaps to landing and roll to 25 degrees. Lower the nose to maintain 90 knots. And again, look how 25 degrees is one corner of the windshield to the other. 5 degrees down sees the angle of attack meter just below the horizon there. And we'll roll out roughly north. If you have trouble with the TBM in the circuit, you're probably not trimming it quite enough. Let's pause again on base leg. So we can see where the road bridge here crosses over the coast. That's a reasonable point to be aiming for that 1.5 mile circuit from 1500 feet. We're at 90 knots, torque is a little bit high, 20% is what we're aiming for. We're going to turn final and hopefully be stable on the PAPIs by 500 feet radio. What's important flying in the circuit, what's really useful in the TBM 900 is the angle of attack gauge. At the moment it's not displaying anything other than that green bar. Angle of attack is not a concern. The angle of attack is essentially an indication as to how much extra performance the wing has available, and as we slow down and ask the wing to provide lift at a lower speed, the angle of attack increases, and as it increases it gets closer to the stall. You'll see this indicator light up and the amount of green will reduce the closer the aircraft gets to the stall. If we get into the yellow when we're flying, we need to reduce the back pressure on the stick or lower the nose and increase power, because we want to keep flying the aircraft safely, and the alpha gauge gives us that information. The base to final turn is the #1 place where inexperienced or reasonably new pilots come unstuck. And to be quite honest, there's been a lot of fatalities over the past number of years with student pilots training. It's a very easy place to enter a stall spin as you go through the center line, increase the angle of bank, increase the back pressure, and you end up with an incipient spin. And at 800 or 900 feet, there's not enough space to recover. The alpha gauge should protect us from all of that. If we keep that alpha gauge in our scan and respond to it if it tells us something bad is happening, that will keep us safe. Let's take the pause off. So looking at the angle to the runway, that looks fairly reasonable at the moment. Just making sure we're in trim. Maybe a touch on the high side if anything. I'll just lower the nose ever so slightly. And we'll start the turn. Again, you've got to make sure you're in trim, or if you take your attention away from the pitch for a moment, you'll end up with a pitch down or a pitch up, which is not what we want. So as I said, slightly high on the base leg. I was probably talking a little bit too much anyway. We'll see if we can correct it. There we go, we've got one PAPI that's red, and we should end up with 2 and 2. Notice I haven't really touched the power. I'm making very small movements on the power. There you go, 500, I've got 2 and 2. Again, it's not an airliner, so we're looking for a fairly sensible approach profile at 500 feet. On this approach though, we're going to go around anyway to demonstrate the go around. but we could easily land from this position here. A go around in the TBM is entirely straightforward. We're going to add power, pitch to 10 degrees, and clean up the aircraft as we accelerate. The flight directives would be available with the toga button. We'll do this one manually. So, go around. Power, coming up. Pitch for 10 degrees. 10 degrees we have. Above 85 knots. Flaps to takeoff. And above 90 knots with a positive rate of climb, gear up. As the gear comes up, there's a significant nose up pitch. We've got a lot of power on now, and the aircraft was quite significantly out of trim. Manual go around, you have to trim extensively. So I'm accelerating at a 10 degree pitch altitude, going through 1,000 feet. I'm just going to back the power off now. And we'll fly level towards 1,500 feet, and then we'll go around the circuit again. So 1,500, torque's coming back to 30%, setting the pitch attitude, and rolling into the turn. Making sure that we always double check the trim. It's very easy on a desktop simulator to end up holding a little bit of pressure, especially if your joystick has got a very low spring force. Maybe just a touch too much power here. So, trim for the crosswind leg, looking for the turn. There we go, 25 degrees. And again, just watch that horizon on the top of the instrument panel there, the top of the engine cover. And look how the horizon goes from the top left to the bottom right of the windscreen. Very easy to fly the aircraft on visual reference, easier than flying it looking at the PFD. I'm working on an extra video to talk about angle of attack in a little bit more detail. Hopefully that should be released a couple of days after this video. But here we are on the downwind leg. GPS says 1.5 miles, that's fine. Put the gear down, increase the power, about 40% torque to offset the extra drag of the gear, holding some pitch at the moment. Once the gear's down, I'll trim out that pitch difference there. The gear causes a nose down pitch moment. So downwind, gear down, 3 greens, fuel sufficient, landing field elevation is set. Downwind checks are complete. And again, we're just waiting for the 45 degree point to make the turn. Now on the next circuit, we'll stop at 1,000 feet. We'll do a touch and go and stop at 1,000 feet. So for the 1,000 feet circuit, I want to be downwind at 1 mile rather than 1.5 miles. 1.5 miles, 1,500 feet is a very relaxed circuit in the TBM. 1,000 feet is a bit tighter in. So looking back at the runway, there's that 45 degree point. So I'll start bringing the torque back. Looking for 20%, holding the nose, flaps to full, or flaps to landing I should say, and rolling to 25 degrees, lowering the nose to maintain 90 knots, and trim. I'm going to say trim an awful lot in this video, but it really is the key to flying the TBM manually. I've only ever flown a single engine turboprop for a few minutes, and I was surprised at how heavy the aircraft was in pitch. And that's to be expected with an aircraft with a very wide speed range. So looking at where that bridge crosses over the coast, the downwind and the base seem to be in the right sort of place here. Just trying to judge the turn on. I don't want to be too high, I don't want to be too low. But before I start thinking about the turn, thinking about the trim one more time. Good place to turn, and we go. Happy's looking reasonable. I've got 1 red at the moment, that's okay. Notice I'm not adjusting the power, I'm just lifting the nose ever so slightly, as we descend onto the 2 and 2 Pappies. Dundee's Pappies are 3.75 degrees, just a little bit steeper than some other airfields. So this will be a touch and go landing. That's fine. It's built up on the torque and we've got 2 and 2. So we're at a reasonably light weight at the moment. Minimum approach speed on the TBM is 80 knots. I don't know whether that's for control authority or some other certification reason, but at heavy weights you'll see the alpha gauge come in at 85 knots. You'll see the alpha gauge at a heavier weight, but at lighter weights we are limited by that minimum approach speed. The wing isn't working quite as hard at the moment. Again, my extra video on the angle of attack is hoping to explain that. I'll concentrate on the landing now. So looking at the far end of the runway, arresting the rate of descent, easing the power back to idle, holding the aircraft off, and touching down. Lower the nose, flaps to take off, trim to take off, and torque coming up. It's a fairly short runway, Dundee, so I'll not wait for the flaps to be selected into that gate. Take off, 85 knots, or rotate. Positive climb, gear up. Pitching for 15 degrees as before, and circuit at 1000 feet, so I'm going to lower the pitch attitude at around about 500 feet. 500, lower the nose until I can see ahead, and ease the power back, roll into the turn. Again, the performance on this aircraft is really exceptional. When you're learning to do this initially, feel free to fly straight ahead, climb up to your circuit altitude, get stable in the circuit altitude, and then roll into the turn. It's not like you're struggling up there at 300 feet a minute. What we do have though to do the 1 mile downwind is to turn fairly promptly onto that downwind leg. If you let the speed accelerate, the circuit size will increase dramatically in the TBM. That's why I'm keeping it below 115 knots with flaps to take off. And you'll see even then it's a bit of a struggle to keep it inside 1 mile. Remember when we did the circling, we were back at about 90 knots with the flaps already out, and that was only 0.8 miles. So here we are, downwind, 1 mile cross track, closer in, lower down, but the aspect to the runway looks similar. Put the gear down, increase the power to 40% torque. Again, that's just a datum for you to work with. If you're heavier, you'll need a little bit more. Holding off that pitch down moment and then trimming it for level flight. So rather than pointing at the hill now, I'm pointing at this this corner in the river here, kind of halfway between the two bridges. So looking over a shoulder, there's that 45 degrees again. The bridge is a good reference as well. I'll start bringing the power back, so torque to 20%. Flaps to landing, rolling to 25 degrees, lowering the nose for 90 knots, and trim back a few clicks. So as we roll onto the base leg, a little bit closer in, the visual reference I'm looking for is that apartment block there rather than the bridge itself. I'm possibly a little bit tight on this one. We'll see how it goes. I'll keep coming down. Hopefully that'll be okay. Keeping that alpha gauge in the scan. Again, less of an issue at lighter weights. 500 feet, 2 and 2 on the Pappies. I'll lift the nose, just dropped into 3 reds momentarily. Get that back, there we go. Torque is 20%, and again, I'm slightly out of trim, that's why we've dropped into 3. So I'll just apply a little bit of back trim, and then we'll correct the flight path. It's just a fraction more torque. So you can see the angle of attack gauge displaying at the moment. And it's about to call airspeed. There we go, 80 knots. So I just put a bit more power in. And this is fairly common at heavier weight, seeing the angle of attack gauge move in and out. I don't want to go below 80 knots, I do want to just fix my trim there, and we'll concentrate on the landing. So if the angle of attack was in the yellow area, that would be a bad thing. Looking at the far end of the runway, arresting the rate of descent, easing the power closed, and putting the aircraft down. Flaps to takeoff, pitch to takeoff, trim to takeoff, and power. Rotate. Pause to climb. Gear up. So you can see 15 degrees nose high. We can't really see that out the window. We do need to use the PFD for that. But 10 degrees we can just about eyeball. There's 500 feet below the circuit. Lowering the nose. I can see ahead, so I'll roll into the turn. And I'll ease off on the power. There's 1,000 feet. Lower the nose. And we'll make this circuit to land. If you're practicing circuits, and this holds true in real life as well as the simulator, it's never a good idea to do a lot of circuits. You know, 4, 5, 6, that's about the most you'd want to do. In real life it's quite tiring, and it can be counterproductive as well, because what you're trying to do is flying based on visual reference. You're trying to arrange your flight based on how the runway looks to you. But if you do more than 3 or 4 circuits, what you're actually doing is correcting what went wrong the last time, as opposed to treating each circuit as a new circuit. You're simply fixing a mistake you think you made on the previous circuit. There's gear down, power coming up, holding the pitch attitude, and trimming out the elevator force. Picture looks reasonable. Cross track 1.05, I'm happy with that. So yeah, if I'm doing circuits in the simulator, I've probably done about 50 circuits around Dundee, exploring the best way to use this aircraft in this flight regime here. But I try and do 3 or 4, then fly away, do something else, and then come back to the circuit, rather than keep bashing it around, because after 5 or 6 you're just changing what you did previously. Here's the 45 degree point, torque's 20, flaps to landing, rolling, and reducing the pitch attitude. Gears down 3 green. There's that apartment block. Torque sensible, speed's 90 knots. We'll keep the alpha gauge in the scan on the base turn. I'll check the trim. It's fine where it is. And we'll start that turn. So be very careful of the tendency to drop the nose on that final turn there. Equally, if you're going through the centre line, just accept the fact you're going through the centre line. The thing that kills pilots is increasing the bank angle and pulling back. On an aircraft that is prone to misbehaving in the stall, a less benign aircraft like a Tomahawk, that'll have you on your back in no time. So just be very careful. There's about 82, 83 knots, torque around about 20%, nothing shown in the alpha gauge. Remember, we're at lighter weights, so 80 knots minimum approach speed. We could reasonably fly this about 5 knots slower. It also means there's an increased tendency to float on the touchdown. So arresting the rate of descent, easing the power to idle, and holding it off. Lower the nose, and we'll come into maximum reverse. Right to taxi range now, and we'll look for a turning spot. We've got to backtrack at Dundee. I'll just use a little bit of pedal braking now, and then we'll make a turn on the runway. So turn this way by about 30 degrees or so, and then we'll turn back the other way. Again, the point in this circuit is to learn what the visual references look like, not just the local landmarks. That's good for learning how to land, but not very good learning how to fly to other airfields. But looking at how your airfield, how the angles to your airfield are from the aircraft, if that makes sense. So on this aircraft, if you see the runway running along the top of the radome here, then that's probably a reasonable angle to look at. And again, over your shoulder here, that's about 45 degrees. I'm going to leave everything else on the aircraft as it is, so flaps are still out, lights are still on, everything's set as before, and we're going to leave it that way until we vacate the runway. And what we'll do is we'll taxi in, we'll shut down, and then we'll look at motoring the engine. It's my intention to take the aircraft on a little bit of a flight after this, so we need to shut down, load some passengers in, and then start it back up again. It takes a good hour for the engine ITT to cool down by itself, so we can do the motoring process instead. But let's now we're clear the runway. I'll bring the flaps in, taxi lights on, probes are off. And I don't think I used the weather radar. No, that's all fine. Turning on the apron, I'll just switch the nose light off altogether. So close quarters manoeuvring in a simulator is fairly difficult. Again, that depth perception is not your friend. But certainly for my eye point in TBM, I think I'm adjusted slightly higher than perhaps stock. But with my eye point, anything I can see out the window, out just over the nose here, if I turn tightly, then the wingtip will not go beyond what I can see on the nose, if that makes sense. So as long as the fence line here doesn't go below the nose, the wingtip will not hit the fence line. I'm going to buy myself a little bit more space here though. Make sure we're nice and slow. And start the turn. Plenty of space. Stopped. Brake set. Flight idle. Now just start a timer for the cooldown. Excellent. Whilst I'm waiting for the engine cooldown, I'm going to select the... Well, firstly I'm going to reset the trims. In fact, let's just reset the trims and we'll do everything else as we shut down. So I hope the circuit flying aspect made sense today. Just a very quick reminder whilst I'm waiting for the engine to cool down. We use the bearing pointer here, the blue line, on the 45-degree index, i.e. 45 degrees between the magenta line and the blue line, to identify the end of the downwind leg. That worked both at 1,000 feet, 1 mile cross track, and 1,500 feet and 1.5 miles cross track. We tried to minimize power changes on the approach. We brought the power back to 20% torque and essentially left it there. 90 knots on base, 90 knots on base to final, and then lifting the nose and allowing the speed to come back to around about 85 knots. As I said, there'll be an extra video to talk about the angle of attack stuff. So that seems fairly reasonable. Let's switch the air conditioning off, switch the bleed off, and I'll come back to low idle. Master caution for the bleeds. I'll run the timer for 15 seconds down here. Notice the ITT increasing because the cooling airflow through the engine has decreased. There we go, 15 seconds, idle cut off. There's a master caution, that's oil pressure in the main gen low voltage, and another one vacuum low, and we should finally get fuel pressure and auxiliary boost pump. Fuel pressure, aux boost pump. So we'll switch that off. Autopilot trim's off. I'll put the oxygen off. Propeller stopped. I'm going to leave the lights because we're going to motor the aircraft in just a second, but I will switch the inertial separator off. So I'm just going to wait for the inertial separator to close. Whilst that's happening, let's have a look at the engine temperatures. So the engine is around about 300 degrees at the moment. See the turbine's increasing through 300, the combustor's going 340, but that's cooling down. It'll probably settle to around about 310, 320. The start limit is 150 on the ITT. We can motor the engine before start, but we need to be aware of the starter temperature. We can't use the starter continually, so we can only motor for a very short period of time. Because I know this is a short turnaround, I'm going to motor the engine just now. Also, outside temperature is only 14 degrees. If the outside temperature was over 35 degrees, we would have to motor after shutdown regardless due to some concerns about the bearing temperatures. Motoring is very straightforward. It's just like an engine start, except I'm going to make sure the ignition is selected off. We're not going to put any fuel into the engine, but I do have to run the boost pump. The boost pump lubricates the high pressure fuel pump with fuel. So we always make sure that that boost pump is running prior to motoring because the engine's going to be turning over. I can motor for a maximum of 30 seconds. So just to check, ignition off, strobes on, boost pumps on, propeller area is clear, starter and timer. So we get starter, main gen, no ignition, that's as expected, timer's running, and you can see the ITT is dropping off. Now, as I said, we can motor for up to 30 seconds. I'm going to stop the motoring cycle by using the starter abort at 25 seconds. ITT is coming down nicely. 25, starter to abort. And everything stops as we'd expect. So with that, I'll turn the boost pump back to off, nav and strobes off. Make sure everything is set the way we'd expect to find it. That means putting the ignition back to auto, coming down here, making sure everything is selected off, and we can turn the aircraft off. That's us done. So, crash bar off. I'll switch off the standby instrument and switch the fuel to off. I'll put the chocks in now as well. So that was us flying the TBM 900 around the circuit. It's a fairly busy video, that's why I hope pausing it on the first circuit made it a little bit clearer to understand, but if you do have any comments or questions, please leave them in the comment section below. I do hope you enjoyed watching the circuit video. In the next video we'll try and put some of that to use, taking the aircraft on a trip to a smaller airfield on the west coast of Scotland. Thanks so much for tuning in, and I do hope you'll join me for another video soon. Thank you.